Can you all hear me? Okay. Those of you that know me realize that my greatest challenge is standing still. So it's a little different for me. Usually I'm moving around quite a bit, but here I am so that the folks on Zoom can also be part of this program. I'd like to personally welcome, it looks like about 50 people here who came out for this topic. Those of you who know me know that I started with the Master Naturalist with invasive plants that of course segued into native plants, restoration, pollinator plants. And Joan Miller and I were speaking in November of 2019 about tonight's topic. And the reason that I wasn't here sooner is that most of you know I do programs in person, but I typically don't do Zoom only meetings. So here we are. It's a hybrid meeting. Hopefully the technology is working for everybody. And let's jump in. Joan is my timekeeper. This is a vast topic. We could have an entire day workshop on this. And basically I have about 35 minutes. And I have a lot of visuals, but I want really my whole intent tonight is big picture, the scope of the challenge that we face, but also the optimism, the hope, and the tangible things that we can do to make a difference. Every single person in this room is here because you love nature, you love plants, you love biodiversity, you love pollinators, right? Raise your hand. Okay, so we're here because we're passionate about this. Some of you are here for the Water Saver Rewards, raise your hand. Okay. You know, I do that too because I like the free mulch, I like the free tools. But anyway, we're here because this is a topic that we're both excited about and frightened about. Let's move ahead. The United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change was founded in 1988. They are now coming up on their 6th report. It's coming out March 2023. We've learned a lot since 1988. And if anybody wants to get the latest and greatest on climate change, then in March 2023, type in IPCC. It's 198 countries and a panel that represents everything that we know about the climate situation. My message, as all of you know, is that local actions make a difference. What you do in your home, what we do in our neighborhoods, what we do in the various projects, every single person here makes a difference with every single decision. We're ecstatic to hear that CPS Energy is shutting down the coal plant. It's huge. We'll be able to, our air pollution will be better, and lots of positive changes are happening at a large scale situation. Bird City, Texas is a smaller version of a really important program. Those are some local things. And of course, there are thousands of local actions that are taking place right now. What changes are we observing? We're not going to talk about what's happening worldwide. You know about that from your daily news feed. We're not going to talk much about nationally. We're going to talk a lot about what's happening regionally and locally. So we know, and again, we're not here to discuss or debate whether climate change is real, whether or not it's human caused. That's not the topic. The topic is, these are the things we're observing. These are the changes we're seeing. We're experiencing firsthand. We know Winter Storm Uri. I'm from the Midwest and I'm from Michigan. And you know what? This one scared me to death because it was unexpected. It was longer than expected, and we were not ready for it. At that point, Winter Storm Uri covered 73% of America in snow. We know that we have an increase in extreme heat and drought. The 2020 images nationwide. Santa Elena Canyon last summer. Most of you know I worked there for 3 months every summer. Pat and Becky McGuire and I walked 2 miles upstream in Santa Elena Canyon. I've been going there for 34 years. I've never been able to walk 2 miles upstream in Santa Elena Canyon. We know about the heat island effect, and really basically our whole 4 or 5 county region now experiences the heat island effect. Take a look at the Texas map that's almost entirely red. That's the 2011 drought, which rivaled the 1950s drought. The 50s drought was 8 years long. The 2011 drought didn't end until 2015. Take a look at the 2022, not as severe, but a huge challenge for the state of Texas. Now, I want you to hone in. Those of you who are here in person, I want you to hone in on this area. This is one of your SAWS questions. We are in an exceptional drought condition for the central Texas counties of Bandera, Bexar, Blanco, Comel, Gillespie, Hayes, Kerr, Kendall, and Medina. We're basically in an exceptional drought situation. Last year at the airport, we had 11 inches of rain in 2022. This was the Frio River flow on February 15th, south of Concan. We know that there's a lot of discussion about, are we having more or less hurricanes? It's not the number of hurricanes that matter, it's the intensity that matters. We are having more intense Category 4 and 5 hurricanes. The flood events and the extreme rainfall events that go along with those are really unthinkable in many respects. So in 2017, we know that Nederland, Texas had rainfall of 60.58 inches in 6 days. So folks, that's 5 feet. I'm 5'4". That means this much rain in 6 days. So what's happening with a lot of these storms is that the rains, everything is stalling and basically dropping all of that precipitation. We know that there's an increase in wildfires, and I don't know if everybody understands this. We think about the wildfires in California, Colorado, Idaho, the West. Texas is second in the country in terms of the number of acres burned in wildfires every year. And we're also second in the country in terms of risk for people who live adjacent to the wildland. They call it the wildland urban interface. We live next to these areas, folks. The Bastrop fire, everybody remembers that one. And it was the most destructive wildfire in Texas history, based on a combination of the combination that we're seeing increasingly, not enough rain and too much heat. We know it, those of you that are master naturalists, we know that we study the ecosystems, and we know that Texas has a lot of variation. But you know what? All of these sort of artificial boundaries are all merging together. So west is coming east, south is going north. We're seeing these patterns in our plants, animals, and so forth. We talk about plants in terms of the traditional USDA plant hardiness zones. And you can tell just a little bit between 1990 and 2015, we're seeing a lot of, everything is basically moving up, right? So when you look at what zone we are now, that's not the same zone we're going to be in 5, 10, or 15 years from now. We also see changes in plant heat tolerance, and that's based on the number of days over 86 degrees Fahrenheit. It was a pretty hot summer, if I recall, this summer, 58 days over 100 degrees. And actually, my understanding, I was reading about El Nino today, and apparently they're predicting August, September, and into 2024, breaking all heat records to date. So heat tolerance zone is also affects our plants. We've had a shift in growing season. This graph represents the growing season for the 48 contiguous states. And as you can see, if you look at the graph, our growing season is 2 weeks longer. Now, there are variations depending on where you live, and actually I'm a gardener, so I do like that. What I don't like is that I don't have the water to water my garden when, unless my rainwater tanks are full. How does climate variability affect our native and invasive plants? Each decade, plants and animals have shifted 11 miles north and 35 feet higher in elevation. You know, one of the greatest challenges of being a plant is it's pretty hard to move. You know, if we get tired of the heat, we just move north or whatever. If we get tired of the wildfires, we move east. Nature is changing and we can't hold it steady. So we have to find a way to protect it while it shifts. I'm so encouraged in doing the research for this presentation. I'm so encouraged because there are so many incredible people out there right now who are studying this, who are assessing this, who are coming up with solutions, who are trying all kinds of options, because we love our plants, we love nature, and we want to have that continue. Phenology, raise your hand if you know what this word means. Okay, you're going to hear it again and again. I want everybody to say it. Phenology, again, phenology. Impress your friends with this word, because what it means is the study of plant and animal life cycle events in relation to climate and habitat. My husband, Alan, knows more words than anybody that I know on this planet. And he said, what is phenology? so I had one over on him when we talked about this. Okay, we know that the red bud trees bloom at a certain time, the cicadas emerge at a certain time, the antelope horns, the monarchs emerging. Those are all time life cycles. In plants, we're looking at when do the plants leaf out? When do they drop their leaves? When do they flower? When do they produce seeds and fruit? And senescence, another favorite word, is the process of aging. How many of you knew senescence? Okay, I feel that these days, you know, we're all there, but they're also, it's important to know about the process of aging with plants. I lost some of my salvias this year. You know, they were 18 years old. You know, I mean, I give them a lot of credit. They've been through a lot of, you know, heat and drought cycles. And that doesn't mean I can't start over, but, you know, there is such a thing as aging. The insect herbivore connection. If you haven't read Doug Tallamy, get every one of his books on tape or Kindle or in person. He's an amazing person. He changed my worldview about plants. Because way back when, I picked the ones with the prettiest blooms. And then I figured out that it has to do with the food chain. And if we don't pick the right plants for the insects, then everything else in the food chain suffers. So we know that the insects are actually adapting. Why? Because they can move, right? They can fly to another plant. The plants are stuck, but the insects can move. So what we're seeing is that the insects are increasing their rate of consumption. They're accelerating their life cycles, and many of them are increasing from 1 to multiple generations per year. I'm going to give you an example. And they're expanding their range. So if the plant they want is no longer in particular zone or range, they just fly a little further to find it. I'm going to give you an example. How many of you have seen the damage of the mountain pine beetles in the West? Raise your hand if you've seen it. Okay, if you've spent any time in Colorado, it's devastating. Now, first of all, the native mountain pine beetle is a native beetle, but because of the impact of increased temperatures and decreased precipitation, the trees are stressed. And when plants are stressed, they're more vulnerable to pests, parasites, and so forth. So what is happening is that these native pine beetles, which were fairly well contained, have exploded really across all the southwestern states and into substantial amounts of Canada. So they're also expanding into higher altitudes, and most significant, they have adapted from 1 generation per year to 2 generations per year. Now we're talking about in the cold climates, right? You've got a generation, let's say June, July, and August. Well, now we have a generation that starts in May, ends in July, and one that starts in June, ends in August. So we're looking at double trouble here. We also realize that the trees at higher elevations have not yet evolved defenses to stop the pine beetles. We know that these changes, climate variability, are reducing seed production. I also learned something new today about the pecans that just blew me away. So in Mexico, they've lost 40% of their pecan crop. But what's happening is the baby pecans are sprouting. So they're little tiny pecans, they're sprouting, and they're no longer edible. So in terms of the resale value, nobody wants to eat a sprouting baby pecan. But they're doing that as a result of the climate changes around us. So, and many plants, particularly the conifers, they're basically shutting down the whole pollen system. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. We know that the changing bloom cycles and the timely availability of pollen and nectar is at risk. You know, intellectually, we know what the bees do, what the flies do, what all the insects, all the pollinator insects do. But most importantly, we know that pollen provides protein for the developmental stages of insects, and nectar provides carbohydrates for energy. So if we have the pollen but not the nectar, or we have the nectar but not the pollen, we're screwed. They're screwed. In China, there has been such a collapse of so many of their pollinators that they are pollinating by hand. Now, we know that certain crops like cacao and vanilla have been pollinated by hand for many, many years. But look at the very bottom of this slide. The steps involved in pollinating by hand. First, you have to harvest the pollen. Then you have to dry it with the ideal temperatures, store it, and then distribute it. And she has a special wand here. This is a pear orchard in the Sichuan province of China. When you're talking about hand pollination, if we lose our pollinators, folks, there aren't enough people to pollinate the plants that we need. 85% of the foods that we eat are based on pollinators. We know that the changing plant cycles affect wildlife biodiversity. We know they're affecting reduced agricultural production. Texas is a big state. And did you know that Texas is the 3rd largest producer of wheat and the 4th largest producer of rice in the US? So think back to that visual of the 2022 drought map. What's happening with that? Let's talk about vulnerable species. Everyone here knows how much the monarch is suffering. Migratory species are more vulnerable because if they've flown 1,000 miles and the food they need is not there, that's the end of that life cycle at that point. We know that different species will be affected by shifts in resource availability, and the specialists, like the monarchs, are going to be more vulnerable than the generalists. Guess who some of the best, I'll do that later. Let's talk about this particular report. It's not that this is one that you want to read from cover to cover because it's 94 pages long, but Austin, Texas commissioned a report to assess the climate changes with implications for urban forest management. So most of you know that Austin has pretty much divided by Highway 35, the Edwards Plateau and the Blackland Prairie. So we've got the Edwards Plateau here, we've got the Blackland Prairie. The reason I'm talking about Austin here is San Antonio is, Bexar County is 50% Blackland Prairie, 25% Edwards Plateau, and another 25% of South Texas Plains and Post Oak Savanna. So in many respects, what Austin found with their vulnerability study are the implications are important to Bexar County as well. So there we go, Edwards Plateau 25, Blackland Prairie 50%, South Texas and Post Oak 25. Okay, this is what Austin found. The current stressors: land use change, development and fragmentation, drought, alteration of soil, invasive plant species, shifts in fire, and insects, pests, and diseases. You don't have to remember all this, just know that already our forests are under great stress. This is what they determined. And again, I'm applying this to San Antonio as well because we have very similar ecological profiles. They're predicting a 5 to 10 degree increase in average temperature, decreases in precipitation, increases in heavy rain and severe droughts, shift to a climate similar to the arid Southwest, highly adaptive invasive species, and increased vulnerability to wildfires. We talked about that wildlife-urban interface. If they have a wildfire in one of the Austin parks, there are a lot of folks who are going to be affected by that. They also realized in this report that 90% of the existing forest species in the Austin urban forest are vulnerable. We're also realizing that they have increased pests and pathogens, and there are just a few there. We know oak wilt, we know Dutch elm disease, emerald ash borer, bacterial leaf scorch, can't pronounce that, canker, it's a canker. We know that vulnerable trees are more susceptible to predation. We also know that 60% of those trees in the urban forest will experience a negative impact. We're going to lose habitat. And the only gain is that some of those species that are already at the northern and eastern extent of their range may increase, but everybody else is going to decrease. Remember, we're moving north and east. So what are they doing in Austin? Lots of great things. And these are things that San Antonio is doing, City of San Antonio, Sarah is doing, all kinds of the parks, the Texas Parks and Wildlife, national parks. They're reforesting degraded landscapes, restoring karst ecosystems, pollinator habitat. Raise your hand if you've been working on a pollinator habitat in the last few years. Promoting biodiversity corridors so that our creatures can get from point A to point B, including our overpass here in Phil Hardberger Park. Protect and build soils, compost or mulch on site. I was one of those folks that bagged my leaves every single year. I have 2 heritage oak trees in my backyard, and I bagged them and put them dutifully out by the street. Now they fall where they are. And you know what? Doug Ptolemy told me that oak leaf mulch is one of the very best mulches for our insects. So leave them there. And if your neighbors complain, send them to my house, because I've got piles and piles of oak leaves at my house. Increasing water retention on site. We also know that they're promoting land stewardship. Don't forget level 4 land stewardship. Be there. It's a great program. Increase native plant diversity, native seed banks, remove invasive species. There's the age classes again. Educate the public. I've always believed that we can't rely on the folks in Austin to make the changes that are going to happen quickly enough. It has to be grassroots. It has to be every single person in this room who makes a difference. And we get to educate all the people we come in contact with. I've told this story a lot, but when I first started digging up my yard, my neighbor came by and said, "What the hell are you doing?" And now my neighbors come by and say, "How do you get the butterflies to come to your house?" There are a couple of terms I want you to become familiar with, because as these changes are occurring, you're going to hear these terms, and you'll be, if you're tuned into the terms, you'll understand what we're talking about. Forest adaptation is called resilience. So let's think back to the Bastrop fire and the loss of all of those trees. So this group here, they actually call themselves Aggie Replant. Do we have any Aggies in the room? Okay, great. Aggie Replant had planted the loblolly pine trees at Bastrop to basically assist the forest. That's one strategy. Let's go back to this one. So promoting forest health and recovery from disturbances, increasing the diversity of trees that are present, incorporating species more likely to be resilient, reducing water demand, and implementing prescribed burns. These are all things that the Forest Service, the state parks, the national parks, the City of San Antonio, these are all adaptations that we're implementing to help our forests become more resilient. There's a prescribed burn. Okay, I'm going to give you a classic example of a forest adaptation. How many of you been to the Davis Mountains Preserve in West Texas? Okay, we've got quite a few here. So there's something called Operation Ponderosa, and I'm excited about it because I was just there in December. So basically in one decade, there was a 75% mortality of the Ponderosa pines. Now, remembering that Ponderosa pines are only in the state of Texas in a couple of locations, what they call the Sky Islands. They have to be at a certain altitude with a certain, basically microclimate. So what happened is we had the mortality because of the 2011 drought, severe cold snaps, the wildfires, reduced seed production. They stopped producing cones, and attacks by the western pine beetle. So it was a perfect storm. So what did they do? I love the story. So they're all scratching their heads. You know, the preserve manager, it's a nature conservancy program. They were scratching their heads about where they were going to get new seeds to basically propagate. And they were standing in the courtyard of Fort Davis, and they looked up, and there were several Ponderosa pine trees with cones. Now those cones, those trees had come from this just up and over from the preserve way back at the turn of the century. So they had a seed bank that they cultivated and used to replant. So they thinned the trees, they collected the seeds, they propagated and planted seedlings and they're monitoring that to see how it goes. It doesn't sound like a big deal, but I'll tell you what, when you see a ponderosa pine in West Texas, I mean, it gives me goosebumps. Here's another term, and you need to know this because it's controversial, but we have to come to grips with this. It's called assisted migration. The first category is movement within the historical range. So let's say that I'm down in the Blackland Prairie south of town, and I find a really cool grass species, and I decide to move it up here to San Antonio. So I'm still within the historical range, but I'm going to move that plant or that seed and try it out here. The second one is where the movement is just beyond the historical range. So let's say that we take a tree that's in San Antonio, we decide we want to plant that up in South Austin. Maybe it'll work, maybe it won't, but we're moving a little bit further, aren't we? And again, we are assisting because humans are making that transaction. Oops. The last but not least is the most controversial, and we're talking about moving plants far outside the range. And classic example of that is in British Columbia, when they forest all the trees, they're bringing seedlings from 250 miles away because they've already had such an increase in temperature that they know the existing seedlings are not going to reproduce. Assisted migration. What can happen? We can have higher mortality if a cold snap occurs or if they cannot adapt. They could outcompete native species. They could alter wildlife and pollinator habitat or introduce novel pests or diseases. We don't know, but this is a term that is being studied right now by many, many scientists. Here's an example. The monarch. Anybody been down to the Biosphere Reserve in Mexico to see the monarchs? Usually there's at least one in the group. So they overwinter in the mountainside forest. The trees at lower elevations are struggling. So the workers are now planting seedlings higher up the sides of the volcano, 1,300 feet up the mountain. So that's assisted migration, but without those trees, the monarchs have no place to roost. Invasive species, that's my passion. I'm only going to talk about 4 here, but we know that if we have a choice between dealing with climate change and invasive species and our budget is small, let's start with the invasives, because the climate change cost is unfathomable, but we know that we can cut down a Chinese tallow in our yard. Speaking of Chinese tallow, this is tallow, this is ligustrum, this is arundo, and the last one is Brazilian pepper tree, which, by the way, is actually suffering from the cold snaps. Yay! So if you have Brazilian pepper tree, get rid of it, but if you don't worry, because it's probably going to die anyway. Chinese tallow, this is one of your quiz questions, folks. The problem is that Chinese tallow can tolerate several months of wet feet, wet roots. So if you have an issue, like we had 60 inches of rain from Hurricane Harvey, if you've got an issue of wet feet, your Chinese tallows are going to survive and proliferate. Here's a graph. This is what's happening with Chinese tallow in the coastal plains. It's incredible, and they are moving north, folks. So Austin sees it as a risk, which means that we do too. The glossy privet, the ligustrums, they're also a big issue. They are functioning as ladder fuels. So, they're a mid-story, mid-canopy tree. What happens is because they're there, then they're carrying the wildfires up to the crowns, which are the hottest and most devastating fires. So we call the ligustrum is causing more intense crown fires. Giant reed, there's nothing good to say about giant reed except that goats will eat it. Using plants as a nature-based solution. Nature Conservancy is really big on this right now. If we use our plants and our existing ecosystems efficiently and effectively, we're already halfway there, folks, with climate change. So let's talk about it. A nature-based solution leverages the strengths that already exist in nature to mitigate or adapt. Our wetlands, we've got to keep our wetlands. I just read that the Okefenokee swamp, they're trying to put in titanium dioxide mines. Come on, we've got to keep the Everglades. We've got to keep the swamps. We've got to keep the wetlands that exist here in Bexar County. It's the river floodplains, the marshes, the peatlands, the deltas, the coastal ecosystems. Most people don't understand that the wetlands in the US, 95% of them are freshwater wetlands. We tend to think about the coastal wetlands, but the majority are freshwater. Mangroves, I never want to know whether to say mangroves or mangroves, but they also are huge, particularly along the coast, slow water, prevent erosion. Where they're there, they modulate the storm surges. When they're removed, nothing stops those surges. Prairies, raise your hand if you're a prairie lover. Okay, you know what? Slow sink and spread. Those roots are 10 to 15 to 20 feet deep. So if we've got even a pocket prairie in your yard, or even a couple of muley plants, that helps. Every little bit helps. Everything we can do to retain moisture in the soil, to retain carbon in the soil, is an advantage. Never underestimate the effect of one muley plant. Forests, we know, capture and store carbon. Temperate forests, boreal forests, tropical rainforests, they all do in varying degrees. And you know what? Choose your toilet paper carefully, because the boreal forest is being destroyed to the tune of 1 million trees per year for toilet paper. Go online if you don't believe me. Look for toilet paper report card. Forests store and capture carbon. How can we help? Raise your hand if you'd like to help. Okay, so we can observe, record, and report. Remember I talked about phenology? The scientists need our boots on the ground. They need to know that we're observing so they can collect the data. I spoke with a woman before the meeting who works for Sarah. She has an IT department. That's all they do is collect the data so they can give it to the scientists. How many of you do iNaturalist or something similar? Citizen scientist programs are extremely important. If you never leave your backyard, what you do is important. There is a Phenology network, and they are actually seeking 4 million reports this year. So if you have an interest in the Phenology network, you can tell them when your red bud bloomed, and when your big maple dropped its leaf, and when your cicada emerged, because they're trying to find national patterns, national, regional, and local patterns. So phenology is important. As a citizen scientist, your information is critical to them. You know, whenever I think about making a purchase, I ask myself the question, do I really need this, or can I take this $20, $50, or $100 and donate it to a worthy cause? And we have so many worthy causes. I don't have enough money to support them all. There are some billionaires who are doing a pretty good job of that, but you know what? $25 here, $50 there, $100 there, it adds up. There are so many places that need our help. And with the money that we share, or the volunteer hours that we share, we're making a huge difference if we help contribute to preservation and restoration. Remember, if we keep these places intact, we're not going to have to start from scratch. If we just preserve what we have, restore what's been slightly damaged, we're going to get there. Native plant installation, pollinator meadow maintenance, wetland restoration. The sky's the limit as far as where we need the help. You know, I was going to put this slide in here. I really feel so strongly about removing invasive plants, starting with your yard, because as you know, I do entire workshops, full day workshops on invasive plant removal. And now that we know what we know, I didn't tell you, I'll tell you right now. So when Austin came up with a list of vulnerable plants, pecan was top of the list. I sure would hate to see our pecans go by the wayside. And those who are highly adaptable and low vulnerability, are you ready? China berry, Chinese tallow, ligustrum, golden rain tree paper, mulberry, the list goes on. So those invasive plants are already wreaking havoc, and they are not going to suffer one bit, except for Brazilian pepper tree. They're not going to suffer one bit from the change in climate. Collaborate with your neighbors and neighborhood associations. There's a neighborhood association, Del Webb calls me every single spring and says, I want another box or two of the native and adapted plants books. They hand them out to new residents so that those residents don't plant a peony or something that just does not belong. You know, and I love peonies in Minnesota, but they don't belong here. Neighborhood associations are critical. If you have one, offer to help them. Create the native plant and pollinator habits. I stole this slide, Anywhere USA, from the NEPSOD program, sorry. So we know that we don't want to be Anywhere USA. Don't give up. If your plants die, talk to your friends, find out. I kept a list of what died during snowpocalypse, and you know what? I had two species that died, but I have 98% native plants. So keep a list, but don't give up. If your salvias die after 18 years, put something else in. Don't get discouraged. Replace them with native plants. Return organic matter to the soil. The soil is one of our best ways to sequester carbon. Don't till your soil. Leave the leaves and create a compost pile. Those are all things you can do in your backyard. Create a wildflower garden. The one that you see here is mine. That's the one I get citations for every year from the city of Castle Hills for the weeds. And every year you can't see my signs, but I have 7 signs on my fence. Every one of them is, you know, homegrown wildlife habitat, backyard habitat. That doesn't stop them. I still get the citation. But anyway, you can create, even if it's a 2x2 pollinator garden. I watch the butterflies and bees come to my yard. They fly right over all the neighbors and they hone in right there because that's where the food is. You can make a pocket prairie. Slow sink and spread the water. You know what? We have some rainwater tanks. It took us about 5 years to get that project underway. We have 3,200 gallons. We've had them for 2.5 years and they've never run dry, and we've had very little rain. A 2-inch rain will fill both of my tanks, 3,200 gallons with a 2-inch rain. If there are ways that you can collect the water from your roof or in your yard, don't let it run down the street into the sewage. It does nobody any good there. Slow sink and spread it on your yard. Create a rain garden, plant those muhly grasses, install a rain barrel, lots of ways to do it. Plant those bunch grasses. I'm a big fan of bunch grasses. Human actions still have the potential to determine the future course of climate. I am not giving up. We are not giving up. We know that there's a lot of information that paints a bleak scenario for us. But you know, I have a friend who just died at 99. So I've got 29 years to go. So I figure that, you know, as long as I'm alive and can walk around or a motorized wheelchair, whatever it takes, I'm going to be out there trying to make a difference, because if we don't, who will? Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has. Thank you. So apparently there are no Zoom questions, so we're going to take questions from the group.
But they can tell them to go.
Oh, but the Zoom folks can submit with the chat line, but I'll just hang here and see what questions we have. If any, don't be shy. Mr. Nicolotis.
Anything to add about keeping the oak trees on your front yard? Over the summer, or is it a point?
I leave them there year round.
So go ahead and repeat his.
Oh, sorry, that's right. So John Nicolotis asked the question about, you know, what, in terms of your oak leaves when they fall, what is there a time when you know, kind of, here's the deal. We're talking about insect life cycles that are 3 to 4 generations. It may take 3 years for that insect to emerge. So if we rake the leaf, it's lost its home. So I will tell you that when the leaves get so thick in my backyard, I do truck a few of them over to the compost bin, which is also, you know, useful, but they don't go to the street anymore. Yes.
There are studies on the change in seasons, growing seasons. Is it like longer because the front end like now is sooner, and is there an additional part that in fall that is making it longer?
So the question was, let's talk a little bit about the growing seasons, and the question is what's changing that? We talked about the 2 weeks. So there's, in addition to that chart that showed the 2-week change in the growing season, we also have at the same site charts that show earlier end of frost in the spring and later frost in the fall. And depending on where you are in the country, they're able to track that data. Now, Texas, interestingly enough, probably because of our location, has that same 2 weeks, but we haven't had that much variation in the earlier, the last frost or the early frost, not as much as they've had on the coasts. So they seem to be experiencing more of that than we do in Texas. But the bottom line is all of us have at least 2 weeks more in terms of planting time and growing season. Yes, ma'am.
Very dismayed to hear about the pines. I was curious. That's a climate thing, not an invasive plant.
It's a climate thing, yes. So the question was, she was disturbed to hear about the pecans. And so basically, pecan, not only is it our state tree, but it's also a huge 60 million pounds of pecans are produced. And, pecans, the price of pecans, thanks to China, it's doubled and tripled, right? It's become the latest food fad. But what's happening in Mexico, they lost 40% of their pecan crop because the little pecans were sprouting, emerging based on climate. So that's another good question. The New Mexico State College or University has a think tank right now, and they're basically studying the genetic differences among pecans so that they can be proactive about potentially developing pecans that are more resilient. There's that word again. Yes. So the question is, have we seen any of the native plants becoming invasive due to climate change? None specifically, but of course, the way I would answer that question is under certain circumstances, native plants can also have invasive tendencies. So if you have a particular native plant that's acting in an invasive manner, it doesn't necessarily mean that the sky is falling down. It just means you need to manage it in your yard. Yes.
As we're shifting to a drier climate here, are you finding yourself shifting to different plants to compensate for the dryness? So you're switching to more drought tolerant plants than you did in the past?
So Fred's question was, because of the changes that we're seeing, am I actually making a decision to choose plants that are more drought tolerant? And the answer is yes. So I've worked with a few projects in town. Some of you have been there helping with us. And so the plants that I put in terms of when you look at drought tolerance, if you look at descriptions of plants, go to the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center, or really all your books, they will tell you, low water, medium water, high water, etc. I'm planting the plants that are in the very low water situation, because that's what we're facing. We didn't talk about, the droughts, but we're talking predicting mega droughts in the Southwest, and we're talking about 10 to 12-year droughts. So if you've got water, if you have the potential to capture water, think about doing that now. If you have a chance to plant plants that are extremely drought resistant, do it now while we still have a little bit of water left.
So the sweet spot right now is drought tolerant and deer tolerant.
So that's another whole topic, Fred. The deer tolerant, the question was drought tolerant and deer tolerant. I was at a woman's house the other day, a friend of mine, and we talked a lot about the deer because they're even eating her sinizos. So, yeah, it's a big issue, but don't give up. The answers are there. Ask all your friends. I think we're probably running, do we have
So we do have a couple
of chat questions?
Somebody asked whether or not they could get a PDF of your PowerPoint.
So the first question is, could somebody get a PDF of my PowerPoint? Everything that I do is public domain. So if you would like a PDF copy of this PowerPoint to share with your homeowners association, with your husband, with your spouse, with your dog, whatever, it will be available. Just, I guess maybe we'll do a sign up sheet and I'll send it out with your email. Yes.
And for the people on Zoom that should they contact you?
So I'll give you my email if you want. You can just type it in the chat. It's mountainlionwoman@gmail.com. That's another whole story. Thank you all for being here tonight. Don't forget to purchase some or to donate some money to buy the plants. You all have been a great audience. Thank you.
Yeah, very, very.